series of the path forward at SIA with this presentation. So we thank y'all for your participation thus far, and we encourage your participation today. My name is Maggie Kelly, and I am one of the Built Environment project managers at SIA. And my trusty co-conspirator, Will Bryan, is joining us today. And we're both going to be presenting some information your way. So I'm going to let Will introduce that and get us started. Will?
Thanks. Thanks, Maggie. The mute button has changed places since I last saw it. Thanks, Maggie. Yeah, we're really excited to have y'all with us today. We're excited to preview some of the work that we're doing on energy equity in the South and the ways that it intersects with energy insecurity. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I mean, this is part of a broader project that SIA is working on along with the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, an organization out of Austin, Texas, that focuses on energy affordability in Texas. And as part of that project, we're trying to kind of grapple with, what is the landscape of energy equity? What does that look like in the South? And so by the South, we mean all of SIA's territory with Texas added on. And then, how do we develop some frameworks to guide decision makers, whether they're in utilities, whether they're on public service commissions, whether they're in the housing sector, to make more equitable decisions based on the data that we have. So that's kind of the broad project. We're going to be walking you through a little bit of it today. And as Maggie said, I mean, this is a pretty presentation heavy moment that we have. If you know anything about my background, I'm used to speaking in 50-minute chunks of time. We probably won't go quite that long here, but we want to walk you through kind of data on energy insecurity in the South in some detail to give you a sense of kind of what as a region we're confronting. And then also, how can we start to build some decision-making frameworks around this information that can actually guide us in better directions moving forward. So that's really the kind of key today. What I want to do first, though, is I want to kind of get a sense of who is with us. So we're going to kind of open a poll question here in Zoom for you, because we want to see who all is in the room, what sectors you're representing today, what organizations, and that kind of thing. So we're going to launch a poll question here real quick, and if you can respond, that will be wonderful. Take about 30 more seconds to answer that question, and then we'll get going. Okay, thanks for that. It looks like we have a kind of a range of people here with us today, mostly community-based organizations and advocacy organizations. Then we also have government policymakers. We also have some contractors and service providers and utilities and providers as well. So welcome to all of you. We're excited to have you with us. And as far as the question about whether you work with cost-burdened households, 75% of people joining us today do. So that's excellent, because that's going to be a lot of what we discuss today. And then kind of getting a sense of like how you qualify customers for discounted or no-cost options, whether you work in utility space or housing space. It looks like income and energy cost burdens are kind of the leading ways that people are involved in that. So that's great. That's going to be very helpful, I think, as we move forward, because we're going to be talking about sort of how do we actually understand what it means to be cost burdened? How do we measure that? And then ultimately, how can we kind of use that to move forward? And finally, the primary metric for measuring program success at organization, maybe not surprisingly, utility bill savings, reduction of bad debt, and collection costs for the utility, are key. But then also program annual energy savings and environmental and social benefits as well. So that's great. That's great. Okay. So I want to kind of start with, I think, what got SIA into this work. And that's really this statement that the South has the lowest electric rates in the contiguous United States, but it has the highest electric bill. If you look at this chart, you can see that the East South Central, South Atlantic, and West South Central census divisions, which make up the South as we're defining it, have the lowest electric rates in the country at 11 and 12 cents on average per kilowatt hour. And yet they have the highest bills in the contiguous United States at $138, $131, and $127 each month. So I want to take a minute, and we have one more poll question to ask you kind of here about what do we make of this? How do we kind of grapple with the fact that we have such low electric rates but such high bills? And so we have one poll question to get at that we're going to run now. So please take a few seconds once it pops up and give us your thoughts on this. I should say 2 poll questions. And we'll take about 30 more seconds to answer this one. Already a lot of responses rolling in. That's great. Great. Thanks for everybody who responded to that. Some really great answers. So to the question of what explains these disproportionately high electricity bills for low-income households, the vast majority of you said condition of the housing. We also have quality and age of equipment coming in second, and then lack of green infrastructure in third, followed by customer behavior and activities and number of people living in the home. That's very interesting. And then who should be responsible for fixing this problem? This one's very interesting. A lot of people said federal, state, or local government, 88% of you, followed by the utility. 68% of people said the utility should be responsible for fixing this problem. 62% said homeowner or landlord, and 35% said nonprofit or community-based organizations. Very, very interesting. We're going to kind of circle back around to that as we go through this presentation, but just kind of keep that in mind, because I mean, I think ultimately that's one of the big questions that we have with this work, right? Is, what does the data show us about the landscape of energy equity in our region? But then also, how can we ensure that this data is in the hands of people who actually have decision-making power in all of the many areas that it's going to take to actually solve these issues? And we'll talk more about that as we go through. Great. So, as we think about this disparity at SIA, I mean, obviously in the Southeast, cooling loads are partly responsible for high costs, especially electricity. But we think it's actually part of a bigger problem, or indicative of a bigger affordability, infrastructure, and housing problem that we see in the South. And ultimately, frankly, I think it also highlights the effects of kind of historical policies in our region that have long favored keeping costs for generation and transmission low, and providing little investment in demand side efficiencies that might benefit consumers. And really, the kind of low rate but high bill result, I think, is where we've ended up as a result of those kind of multi-generation policies. And so as we think about the effect of these high bills, I think it's important to highlight that high bills disproportionately impact you if you are low income or a person of color. That is especially true in our region. Millions of people in the South struggle to pay their electric and gas bills every month, and more customers are cost burdened in the South than any other part of the country, both as a proportion of the region's population and as an absolute number. And a good kind of rule of thumb is that 1 out of every 3 people in our region has trouble paying their utility bills from month to month. And so the way we're framing it at SIA is that these Southerners live in a state of energy insecurity. And that just means that they struggle to maintain vital energy services, things like heating, cooling, lighting. And, you know, this is certainly an affordability challenge, but I think it goes beyond affordability. It's about, you know, the health impacts. It's about access to physical infrastructure that allows you to lower your bills. And so, you know, energy insecurity, I think, is a broader framing than just looking at energy cost burdens, which is a little bit more narrow. And we're going to get into that a little bit as well. And I think we have one more poll question here, just to kind of get a sense of how you relate to these issues as well. So we'll bring that up. And if you'll take maybe a minute or so to respond to that, these are very helpful for us. I think that. Yeah, and in particular, we want to know kind of how, you know, because these high bills disproportionately impact you if you are a person of color, we're really interested in, you know, your views on the impacts of these racial disparities on the energy and housing sector. And that's what these questions are getting at. So we'll give you about a minute or so to respond to these. Take about 30 more seconds and then we'll see what everyone answered. All right. Great, thank you. So fortunately, you know, I think 97% say that it's valuable to examine, strongly agree that it's valuable to examine and discuss the impacts of race on our industry. 50% have a basic understanding of concepts related to racial equity, while 47% say they somewhat agree with that. And then finally, as far as the barriers that prevent your organization from investing in low-income households or communities of color, the leading contender was other. So I'm kind of curious about that. If you have specifics about that, feel free to enter them into the chat function. We'd love to kind of get that feedback just to sort of have an understanding of what those barriers might be. Cost effectiveness, maybe not surprisingly, is the second contender, followed by low program awareness, housing condition that's too poor to weatherize or add efficiency measures, and then a split incentive between renters and landlords and a lack of trust. Very, very interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. This is very helpful. And so, you know, as we at SIA have been grappling with energy insecurity, like it sounds like many of you at your organizations, you know, we've realized that we also have to grapple with, you know, where these issues came from. And, you know, energy insecurity is not something that just kind of emerged suddenly. Energy insecurity is something that's very much rooted in historical racial and economic inequities, which still shape energy and housing in our region and make it difficult to get access to affordable power if you are poor or if you are Black. And this is something that really goes back into Southern history. And in particular, thinking about kind of in the utility sector, the South's first electrification in the late 19th and early 20th century, as Southern companies started building big dams to harness rivers to generate electricity. This became one of the biggest businesses in the South, and the energy sector regularly outpaced the rest of the country in the early 20th century as a result of the opportunities here in the South for electrification. It was revolutionary, frankly. Electrification changed the modern South in a lot of ways. It changed the way people traveled. It changed the way people lived. It changed the way the business landscape operated. It changed almost everything about the modern South. One thing it did not change, though, was the social dynamics of the South. And electrification, I think it's important to point out, was never intended to be, and it never was, a democratic process. By the 1920s, 84% of all the electricity in the South was controlled by only 7 companies. And as policymakers and citizens in these states began to be concerned about, the concentration of power, both literally and figuratively, I guess, in the hands of just 7 companies, they started to establish new state regulatory agencies. These are the origins of our public service commissions today, to provide oversight over electric utilities. But I think it's important to note, and this is, I think, a really kind of critical point, that these new agencies and the utility companies that they were designed to provide oversight over excluded Black voices. These new agencies were developed at the very same time that white Southerners were writing segregation into law and disenfranchising Black voters. Same period of time. And so new regulatory agencies and utilities themselves, very much deliberately did not consider Black voices as a part of their decision-making process, or really give Black communities a voice in the energy sector. And even as the federal government became involved in energy in the 1930s through the Tennessee Valley Authority and rural electric co-ops, Black Southerners were still left out of that sector almost entirely. Rural electrification initiatives, like I said, through the Tennessee Valley Authority and these cooperatives often provided racially stratified services, and they did not provide opportunities for input from Black Southerners. And so, I think it's important that we name this and we recognize that from its inception, the South's energy system was intended for white people only. And the legacies of this history are really critical in understanding how we got to the point that we are today. And it's critical to, acknowledge this if we want to have any hope of providing more equitable policies moving forward. Because, this history today still, I think, disproportionately prevents communities of color from participating in decision-making processes in the energy and housing sector and getting access to clean and affordable sources of energy. And I think we have one more round of polling here, and we just kind of want to get a little bit
Actually, well,
further
I think
input.
we got it. I think we got it.
Oh, we got it. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Well, then we'll move over kind of into the housing system too, because energy is one key part of that history, but housing segregation offers sort of the other key part of that history in understanding how we got to the point that we are today. And I think it's important, again, just as we acknowledge that the energy sector has been, primarily intended, at least historically, for white Southerners only, that has also been true of housing as well. And the legacies of residential segregation continue to impact people of color and prevent them from getting access to healthy and affordable housing today. It's important to note that housing segregation existed for decades before the 1910s, but by sort of the early 20th century, white policymakers had started actually writing racial zoning laws onto the books. These laws were later declared unconstitutional, but frankly, the South didn't always care about what the Supreme Court said, and so city officials throughout the South still found ways to write housing segregation into law. And by the 1930s, that really culminates in an effort by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is a federal agency who developed a series of maps that categorized neighborhoods and cities throughout the United States for mortgage lenders. And it categorized them on the basis of, is it hazardous to lend to people buying a house in this neighborhood, or is it safe to lend to people buying a house in this neighborhood? So it categorizes neighborhoods on the basis of whether they were hazardous or safe. These categories were almost entirely based on the racial makeup of those neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous for mortgage lending, which influenced mortgage lending practices, kind of moving forward, were largely Black or Hispanic neighborhoods throughout the United States, whereas neighborhoods that were deemed safe for mortgage lending were largely white. And so this is one of those maps for Birmingham, Alabama. You can see the yellow and red neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are deemed hazardous for mortgage lending. These are places where banks and other lenders would deny mortgages for people seeking them, largely because those were largely Black neighborhoods, whereas these neighborhoods kind of further south are largely white, and they were deemed safe for mortgage lending. Okay, so if we think about kind of the impacts of this type of policy where mortgages are denied simply as a result of the socioeconomic breakdown of the neighborhood and the compounding effects of that over decades and decades and decades of history, then that starts to help explain how we get to the point that we are today. And so I want to just kind of show you one thing, and that is I want to overlay energy cost burden data on top of this map. This is what energy cost burden data looks like for Birmingham, Alabama. And you can see that the darkest red places pay in excess of 14% of their income every year for their energy, whereas the lightest places pay less than 6%. And you can see that it largely tracks along that kind of divide that was established in the 30s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps, where neighborhoods to the north, largely Black neighborhoods have the highest energy cost burdens, while the white neighborhoods to the south have the lowest energy cost burdens. That trend is also true in other parts of our region. This is Dallas, Texas. Here you can see again, yellow and red. This is a map from 1937, developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Yellow and red neighborhoods were neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous, whereas blue and green were deemed safe. Looking at the energy cost burden data again, you see that pattern of high energy cost burdens, in excess of 12 or even 14% of your income persists in those neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s. There are a lot of steps to get us to this point, but I think it's important that we begin to kind of acknowledge the impacts of some of these historical policies on shaping the landscape that all of us work in today. And so as the maps show, I think, it's important to note that neighborhoods that have a history of being racially segregated are the neighborhoods that are at the highest risk for energy cost burdens today. And this reflects, just one of the ways that the historical legacies of racial segregation still shape access to affordable energy in our region. And, it's not a direct line necessarily from the 1930s to today, but there have been many policies and decisions in the years since that have compounded these problems. So for instance, there hasn't been state or local action to stimulate the construction of energy efficient, affordable housing. And there's been little action to prevent displacement in rapidly growing areas. Atlanta, probably the best case study of that in terms of displacement. Regional policies and building industry trade groups for decades have resisted energy codes that might provide minimum acceptable standards for new building. The South's energy codes lag far behind the rest of the region. And in fact, one state in our region, Mississippi, has no energy codes on the books. Low-income communities face higher outdoor temperatures than other communities because they lack access to green infrastructure at a higher rate than higher income places. So for instance, parks, green spaces, that type of thing. And so if you're low income or a person of color, you're really starting at a disadvantage because you have to, cool your home more in times of high heat than someone maybe just blocks away who's higher income. Access to electricity, gas, and water can be shut off for non-payment even in periods of dangerous heat or cold in parts of our region. There are few state-level protections for consumers. Low-income tenants lack capital. We talked about the split incentive problem. And they don't control their housing, but they pay the cost of maintaining dangerous and inefficient residences. At the same time, low-income households are functionally excluded from most utility-administered energy efficiency and renewable energy programs because it requires a lot of capital to participate in these programs. And low-income households just simply don't have that. And yet, they also pay higher fixed fees on their utility bills to fund these energy efficiency and renewable energy programs for other consumers. And finally, I think it's important to note that federal energy assistance programs like LIHEAP and weatherization assistance, which are very critical, are just chronically underfunded. LIHEAP, I believe, reaches only about 20% of eligible households in a given year, and that's the best case scenario. And until 2006, the South was sort of under-resourced through these programs because LIHEAP disbursements were calculated using a formula that gave preference to heating dominant climates in other places. So as all of these issues have intertwined, the result has been energy and housing systems in the South, where if you are low income or a person of color, you will almost certainly pay a higher financial and health price to keep the lights on, to keep the heat on, to keep the air conditioning on than anyone else. And I want to kind of take a moment and step back for a second, because I think, this is a question that at SIA we're struggling with, is how do we overcome these barriers? What solutions do we see that have actually worked to overcoming these barriers? And then kind of, what does a focus on racial equity and inclusion mean for that work in your organization? So if you could take a second and just, if you have a response to these questions, we'd love to see it. You can include it in the chat window. But, have you observed solutions for overcoming these barriers? And, what does it mean for your organization to have a greater focus on racial equity and racial inclusion? And we'll take just about 30 seconds to do that, and then I'll keep moving. And we'll kind of revisit this at the end.
All right, well, as people are taking time to read over those questions and kind of really sit in and figure out what they think around that, we'll give y'all, like we said, through the end of the presentation, and thank y'all for the responses that you're sending already. I'm going to talk a little bit about that inefficient housing stock. So we'll set the stage in talking about how there's been disinvestment in those red line neighborhoods in the homeowners loan corporation maps back from the 1930s, but we would be remiss if we did not mention that this was a completely legal and used practice by the federal government until the late 1970s. And so that really matters when it comes to thinking about the housing stock that exists now in the region that we serve. Largely because most of the housing in our region has existed since this time of disinvestment, whether it was mortgage, right? So looking at buying a house that's newer on the market, or an investment in upgrading equipment or upgrading a home that you already live in, those redlining practices attributed to those lending pieces. And so what we know is that when we have disinvestment in housing, it leaves our low-income communities without access to safe, healthy, and efficient housing when it comes to energy that can be found at an affordable price. And what we also know is that 53% of the residential buildings in the South, so that's the 11 states that SIA serves, plus Texas, were built before the nation's first energy codes in the 1980s. And so those building codes require builders to meet minimum acceptable standards for comfort and efficiency where they're developed. And you here see this graphic looks at each of the states that we're looking at and where and really the split of housing. That red color on the map is before 1940. The blue is 1940 to 1960. Green is 1960 to 1980. So that's anything red, green, or blue is pre-energy codes. The purple is 1980 to 1999. 2000 to 2009 is orange, and a tiny sliver in a lot of our states are 2010 plus. And so when we look at a map like this, we can really start to see the split of the housing stock, right? And so when we're talking about inefficiencies around energy, we recognize that majority of the housing in the region that we serve wasn't even built when there was a standard. And this data also includes upgrades. So this is just looking at contemporary housing stock and where the energy codes may lie. So more than half of all of our states in our region use an energy code that was developed more than a decade ago. And there are states in our region that are working to roll back the energy codes that are on the books. And this is why SEIA is very involved in our energy code process. So while we see new buildings being built in the time of energy codes being available, what we recognize is that the energy codes on the books are not as efficient as they could be. Those standards could be better compared to national model codes. And there is no code in the territory that we are studying that is not amended. So taking the whole model national standard, when it's adopted at a state or local level, is amended to the point where it's no longer as efficient, as affordable, safe, or healthy for the occupants of those residences. And so we can actually take a deeper dive into what it looks like when you actually get into the state. I'll note that these colors are exactly the same as the graph before it, and you see a lot of green and blue here. So that is that 1940s to 1960s in the green, and the 1960 to 1979 in the blue. And if you're from Georgia, or you're aware of the Georgia space, you can see Atlanta, Columbus, Augusta. You can see those bigger cities like Macon and Savannah. But we recognize, right, that most of these dots, and each of the dots are 5 housing units. Each of those dots most of them are still in that space of pre-energy codes. And we can go even deeper and look at just the city of Atlanta. And the same things come to be true. What we do recognize is that there are newer pockets of housing in cities, and especially like the city of Atlanta. You do see some of that pink and orange and light blue appearing here, which is really 1980s and beyond and up to contemporary times. But they're often located in middle to high wealth suburbs, and really and truly inaccessible to low wealth communities. And I don't think include this in our presentation today, but we've taken the redlining maps of the city of Atlanta and overlaid it with our energy burden data as well. And the same phenomenons are true here. And it really even overlaying housing stock on top of it, which gets really messy and not super intuitive for those of us who aren't super into the wonkiness of data. But we see that these trends continue, that this inefficient housing stock sits in the area of high burden, of red line districts. So it really starts to give us a good idea of what we're dealing with. Additionally, we recognize that southern states like Texas have a high proportion of mobile and manufactured homes that were at best built to a HUD standard from 1994. And mobile homes built before 1976, so we're still looking at a redlining era where that was legal, were unregulated. So we either have, either a standard at best from 1994 or completely unregulated. And these residents face a very high likelihood of affordability challenges around energy and associated health and safety risks. We'll also note that Texas, it leads the nation in the largest increase in number of residents residing in manufactured housing since 2009. And other southern states, so as you can see really on that map, have seen significant spikes in manufactured housing throughout our region. So it's really important that we sit back and we look at the 3,000 foot level of what housing are we even talking about when we're talking about energy insecurity? Where are these bills coming from? What is it showing up from? So I think Will is now going to take us into looking a little bit at those financial burdens that we've been alluding to throughout this presentation so far.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So like we said, one of the impacts of inefficient housing is financial burden. High energy costs and energy insecurity disproportionately affect low-income households. And one way to kind of understand this is to measure the proportion of your household income that you use to pay all of your energy bills. And this is a metric called the energy burden. You've probably heard it, or energy cost burden. And so as we start to kind of measure energy burdens across the South, there are a couple important things to note. One is that low-income households use less energy overall, but they have higher energy use intensities, which means they have higher energy use per square foot of their home. And so the result is that they pay a disproportionate share of their income on energy compared with other households. And on average, if you're low income, you're going to pay about 3 times more for your energy as a proportion of your income than someone who is higher income. Energy cost burden disparities are especially stark in our region. Energy costs, if you're low income, can exceed 20% of your household income. And getting access to efficient building technologies, things like smart thermostats, heat pump water heaters, frankly, insulation, and good quality housing is very much stratified by race and class. And here I should note that when we're talking about energy cost burdens, it's a little bit hard sometimes to understand kind of what 20% of income means. But I'll just say that HUD considers 6% sort of the maximum you should pay, in terms of your income for your energy bill to be considered affordable. So 20%, we're talking triple that. 5 of the top 10 cities with the highest energy cost burdens for low-income residents are in our region. Number 1 is Memphis, Tennessee, which clocks in at 13% for low and moderate income households. Number 2 is Birmingham at 11%. Number 3 is Atlanta with 10%. Number 4 is New Orleans, also around 10%. And then number 7 is Dallas, Texas at 8.8%. So half of all of the cities that have the highest energy cost burdens in the nation are in our region. Half of the top 10, I should say. And if you're low income in our region, only 88 counties in the South have an average energy burden that is deemed affordable for you, while more than 1,200 have energy burdens that are way above, in many cases, that 6% of income spent. And this is a map that shows where low and moderate income households are at the highest risk for unaffordable energy burdens. And so you can see, the darker the pink color, the higher the energy burden as a proportion of your income. And then the darker blue or green, the higher the proportion of low and moderate income housing units in that particular area. And so the dark kind of bluish purple shows the areas where those two things overlap the most, where incredibly high energy burdens overlap with a very high proportion of low and moderate income housing units. And we can see, there's kind of this trend, right? From Eastern North Carolina, this really kind of dark purple, stretch that runs all the way through the Mississippi Delta here, where you have extremely high, potential for LMI households being at risk for high energy burdens, as well as in West and South Texas as well, too. And so as the map shows, in a lot of the South, there's a pretty strong relationship between areas that have high energy burdens and areas that have a significant proportion of low and moderate income households. And I just want to kind of show you, what the landscape of our region looks like if you are not low income compared to if you are low income. So if you are not low income and you're looking for, say, a place to live in the South based purely on energy costs, which I don't know that anybody does that, but still, you can see that every county in the South on average, you're going to pay less than 6% of your income. So every county in the South is going to be deemed affordable on average for you if you are not a low income person. The landscape looks a lot different, though, if you make less than 80% of the median income for a particular county. And you can see that almost no county in the South, aside from a few in Southeast Florida, a few in Texas, and a few in kind of Eastern Virginia are deemed affordable. Whereas, through this belt in Eastern North Carolina running really up into the Mississippi Delta, and then, kind of this belt in Texas, you're going to pay almost double the rate that is considered affordable for your energy. And so, I want to kind of put this in human terms a little bit, because I think it's sometimes hard to grasp what this looks like for a family of 2. And so this map shows, what you can expect to pay on average as a family of 2 if you make, if you are low and moderate income. So for instance, if you live in Edwards County, Texas, and you are low income, as a family of 2, you make at most $32,250 annually. This county has an average energy burden of 20%, which means that you pay over $6,000 a year, or $538 a month on average for your energy. I believe that will be considered unaffordable. Let's compare that to Elliott County, Kentucky, where if you are low and moderate income, you make at most $26,702 a year. Elliott County has an energy burden of 14%, which means that you'll pay about $3,700 a year or $312 a month for your energy. And finally, let's look at Florida Panhandle. If you are low and moderate income living in Calhoun County, Florida, at most you make $13,000, almost $14,000 a year. If you pay on average an energy burden of 12%, which is sort of the average for that county, that equates to an annual bill of about $1,600 a year or $139 a month. So you can see that energy costs vary widely, but you can kind of start to get a sense of what, how much these affordability challenges can eat up, significant chunks of income for low and moderate income households. And I think it's important to note as well that neighborhoods that have affordable home prices have the highest energy burdens, frankly, in our region. And this is a map of Atlanta. It's a little bit busy, but basically, if you look at the legend, you can see that the darker brown, the higher the energy costs that households pay, whereas the darker the blue, the higher price per square foot. And so we would expect to see kind of dark purple spots where you pay a lot per square foot and a lot on your energy. Maybe not surprisingly, none of those exist. All of the places that have prices per square foot in the $250 range and up, we're talking, on average $500,000 and up, they pay in the lowest bracket in terms of energy costs, while just blocks away, houses that are in the $88 per square foot range, about $80,000 to $100,000 for a mortgage, pay sometimes in excess of $5,000 a year for their energy. And so you can see there's this strict dividing line here in Atlanta, really down through the center of the city, where if you're on this side, you're going to pay a lot for housing and not a lot for energy. If you're on this side, you're going to pay not a lot for housing, but a lot for energy. And I'll say you can start to see some of those neighborhoods that are gentrifying where these two things coalesce. So these darker brown neighborhoods, so for instance, in the west end of Atlanta, you can start to see kind of how gentrification is starting to move into the west end of Atlanta with increased prices per square foot and dropping costs for energy. Okay, so we've talked a lot about kind of financial instability, but I think it's important to note that energy equity in the South is not just an issue of income. If you are Black, you are almost certainly going to pay more for your energy than any other group in the United States as a whole, even when things like income are taken into consideration, and this is true in the South. So this is a map below that shows areas where energy costs, energy burdens overlap with high proportions of Black residents. And you can see that, this is where communities of color are at their highest risk for unaffordable energy. And the pattern really is pretty similar to the one we saw in some of the previous maps, right? Where we have this patch in kind of eastern Virginia and eastern North Carolina that runs down through South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and into the Mississippi Delta. And we also have some patches kind of in South Texas and West Texas as well. At the same time, energy insecurity also disproportionately affects elderly Southerners who live on a fixed income and face, kind of overlapping health risks that can be exacerbated by inefficiencies in the home, which is something that we're going to talk about in a second. And this map, again, shows kind of where elderly residents are at the highest risk for unaffordable energy and all the cascading effects that can have on them, both financially and in terms of their health. And you can see the pattern is not quite the same. There's not this kind of strong line necessarily from Eastern North Carolina, but rather there are kind of patches where, energy burdens are high. That's the darker the pink it gets. And the proportion of the population over 65 is high as well. That's the darker the blue. So these, darkest purple colors are where those two things overlap and where elderly residents are at the highest risk for unaffordable energy costs. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Maggie for a second, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the effects that these disparities have on households throughout our.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about these throughout the case, but we want to make sure that we really pinpoint in and give y'all some data around what we're seeing when it comes to effects. So the problems that we've outlined so far are, by unaffordable energy go way beyond just the energy sector. They contribute to economic insecurity, health risks faced by millions of residents of the South, and really prevent the region from achieving parity with the rest of the nation. And, we've given you some of this financial distress pieces, and Will just went really into detail on that. But high energy burdens really go in a little bit harder on those who are already strapped for cash. With our low wealth households at 15.4 million households in the South are reporting any energy insecurity. About a third of the region struggles to pay their bills month to month, and really, even more pointedly, 7.5 million households in the region that we're looking at are estimated to have a disconnection or a stop service notice. And paying utility bills is one of the leading reasons why people take out exploitive high interest payday loans. And so, these pieces really do look at and spread far beyond just that energy uh, sector. They also, this high levels of energy insecurity have a strain on the resources of utility companies. Those mounting arrearages and disconnections really do have quite an impact. A recent study that we've recently looked at found that even pre-COVID-19, so pre this year, 60% of utility customers defaulted on their payment plan. So even with, functioning efforts to really go at and make sure that people are able to pay for their energy over time, payment plans, whatever a utility may offer, we're still seeing 60% of that default rate. And the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association put out the start of the pandemic here in 2020 that electric co-ops will face about $2.6 billion in unpaid bills by 2022, and really see quite a drastic 5% decline in electric sales over that same time period. So it's really important to kind of look at the full economic picture of what this energy insecurity does. And Will has alluded to this a little bit, but unaffordable homes are unhealthy homes. Inefficient and aging building stock puts residents, especially children, at higher risk for chronic illnesses like asthma that can be exacerbated by pests, moisture, and thermal distress. When we think about inefficiencies in homes, we think about unsealed ducts or openings into a crawl space. We have unconditioned air that comes into a space that can really mess with the moisture and the thermal control of a building. So we get mold, we have openings where pests can enter a home, and that actually leads to health issues. And we have some numbers here that 5 million households in our region have had to leave their home at an unhealthy temperature because of the cost of energy. So either not turning the heat on or not turning a cooling on because of the cost, even when it's desperately needed. And 3.9 million households are estimated to lack access to cooling equipment in their home, or not have sufficient cooling equipment in their homes, putting them at an elevated risk for heat related illness. And I'll touch on that in just a moment. But what I want to show you here is a couple of maps. And so this is the city of Memphis. And for those of y'all who are from Memphis or are aware of their geographic data, you're going to see that sea of poverty here. But what we're looking at is a map that looks at the low income and low wealth energy burden. So if you are, the higher burdened you are, you're going to be further on that pink scale. With the pediatric asthma prevalence, which is the blue color. So the light blue, if you're all the way in that light blue, you're looking at a very high prevalence of pediatric asthma. And the dark purple color, dark blue, dark purple, however it's showing up on your screen, is a high indication of both of those pieces. So you can see here in Memphis, where you have high energy burdens in your low wealth communities and high prevalence of pediatric asthma, those areas are pretty much the same. We're not seeing a whole lot of the high burden or the high asthma separated, although those obviously do occur. We have the same piece for Birmingham, Alabama. Will, if you'll show that map for us. And this general overlay really gives us that same dividing line that we looked at the beginning, where we had really all of our redlined and predominantly Black neighborhoods to one side of the city, and the dividing line where you have uh, the other more invested in areas to the other. And then lastly, we'll show you Atlanta. And those of us who are familiar with Atlanta, we see that I-20 divide. When we talk about neighborhoods in Atlanta, we talk about how they're divided by our major transportation sectors. And you can see in our southwest corridor of the city, we have high burdens, high prevalent asthma rates. It's not going to surprise anybody who's from or familiar with the area. But north of the city, or north in the city and surrounding suburban areas, we don't see that same issue. And really, this map even goes even further than just the prevalence of pediatric asthma, and looks at the ER visit rate. So how many emergency room visits are we having for children in this area? And so, looking at energy efficiency through this lens of health suggests that there's new approaches, that there are new braided opportunities that are necessary to ensure that buildings use less energy, and also really are life safety components, that they provide safe havens for the occupants. Because if we really and truly get to the point of a building, a point of a structure, right, what is it if not for the occupant? And so we really want to make sure that we're looking at all of the lenses of how energy efficiency shows up, and where not only the non-energy benefits are, but where the non-energy harms are when it comes to energy inefficiencies. I'm going to show you one last piece around health. And this piece comes back to our heat discussion. So this map shows the overlay between areas with high energy burdens and high heat. And this is Memphis, Tennessee. So we can, if you look kind of below all of the orange and red dots, those are our heat maps. This blue color actually shows our energy burdens. The darker the blue, the higher burdened that area is. And then, of course, your heat mapping, the darker red or orange, the hotter it is on average. And when we actually look, there's one neighborhood in particular, the neighborhood of Hollywood. And in that area, we see extremely high heat and extremely high energy burdens. And when we look at this, one thing that tells us is not only, and I'll note that in some of the other areas of the city that are not burdened or not considered energy burden, there's a 12-degree difference on average in the temperature just blocks away. Just blocks away, the temperature is so drastically different that we're really starting on a different playing field when we talk about even needing to cool a home, right? If you're already having to cool 12 degrees more in order to reach the same level of cooling or comfort, we're dealing with a larger issue than just the equipment in the home. And think about the additional stress on that equipment over time with that higher heat in that area. And what we do know is that the struggle to cool is only going to become more difficult as we sit in the face of climate change. The South is at risk for killer heat, as a term that the Union of Concerned Scientists have created for our region. The number of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit will triple by 2050, while days exceeding over 105 degrees will increase from fewer than about 9 per year to more than 6 weeks. And we know, right, this increased heat, that the health impacts are going to fall on the same folks, those same communities, those same low wealth households that we've already outlined, and the communities of color that are already suffering at the hands of those. And so it's really important that we look, like I mentioned before, outside of just the energy space and say, what other externalities are really being caused by the work or lack of work that we're doing in our industry. So I'm going to turn it over to Will to talk a little bit about cost savings.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So, I think all of us are in this industry because we realize that energy efficiency is a piece of the puzzle to solving many of these problems. It's obviously not the solution to all of them. It can never do that, but I think it can provide really critical energy and cost savings for residential customers. And it can reduce their exposure to unhealthy conditions in the home. And it also provides benefits to utilities, as we're going to talk about just, kind of really briefly. So, in terms of the savings that we could expect through a very conservative estimate of energy efficiency policies, it's incredibly, significant. According to EPRI, Southern states have the biggest potential savings from energy efficiency out of all the states in the country. By 2035, using a pretty conservative estimate, these savings will range from, at the low end, 6,500 gigawatt hours in West Virginia to more than 87,000 gigawatt hours saved in Texas across all sectors. And here you can see, this is a cartogram of the United States. You can kind of see it's supposed to look like a map of the United States, right? But the area is equal, so you can kind of see what the data is doing a little bit better. And you can see, the most significant savings are Florida, Texas, California, followed by Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama. Other southern states are really kind of critical there. So we're talking really significant energy savings by, just 2035, using a pretty conservative estimate of energy efficiency policies and practices. When we think about what this looks like as a share of the energy sales for a particular state, the South kind of comes to the fore even more, because these energy savings make up a significant proportion of all energy sales in pretty much all of the southern states. And so on the low end, energy efficiency has the potential to replace 15.5% of all energy sales by 2035 in Kentucky, and 21.5% of all anticipated energy sales in Florida by 2035. So we're talking, a fifth of all energy sold in a state can be conserved simply through energy efficiency policies and practices in a pretty conservative scenario. And in the South, this is not true in other parts of the country, but in the South, those gains are biggest if we focus on the residential sector. You can see this is, again, a cartogram, kind of looks like the United States, right? But here we have pie charts showing each state and the proportion of residential savings, commercial savings, and industrial savings that EPRI has calculated. You can see that in many southern states, half of those savings are in the residential sector, or almost half of those savings. And, Florida, more than half, Georgia, about half, South Carolina, about half, Virginia, a little less, North Carolina, about half, Alabama, about half, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas. So the residential sector, and focusing on improving the quality of housing, not only offers benefits to the residents of that housing, especially if you're low or moderate income, but, frankly, it also offers really big benefits to the utilities operating in that space, in terms of load reduction, in terms of, reducing costs for payment plans, arrearages, disconnections, that type of thing. And I think it's important to note that energy efficiency measures have the potential to bring an estimated $13 billion in annual savings for low-income households alone, which equates on average to about a 30% reduction, or I should say, equates to anywhere between 20 and 30% reduction in utility bills each month on average. And here you can see kind of what that looks like, by region. Again, this is the United States. We can see each block as a state, and you can see kind of what the bill savings for each state are, right? And they're pretty significant in this kind of central and southern area. States like Florida, low and moderate income households should expect somewhere around 20 to 25% savings every month on their energy bills as a result of energy efficiency policies and practices. Whereas in a state like South Carolina, North Carolina, you can expect in excess of 30% savings. And again, this is a pretty conservative scenario. And we can begin to see that energy efficiency offers significant benefits. I mean, a 30% reduction in a utility bill might be the difference for a low-income household in whether you can buy medicine for your kids, whether you can put food on the table, and a number of other things that are very much critical to everyday life. So, this energy and cost savings is really significant. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Maggie one last time, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the policy gaps in the South that are preventing us from addressing these.
Yeah, and we've talked about several of these, and we wanted to make sure that they were laid out here in plain English, so that those of you who have joined us today, or as you're sharing and thinking about this problem, and we've just laid out all of this information, you're like, okay, so now what do I do with it? How do we actually start to tackle some of these things, these persistent issues? And we've kind of laid out some of the spaces that SIA already is doing work in, or thinking about, or pursuing funding around, really making sure that we're starting to close these gaps, from things like advancing building energy codes in our region, or ensuring that some of our states or jurisdictions have building energy codes, and resourcing those building departments, builders, contractors, developers with technical information to make sure that they know how to properly apply the code and the standards to really realize those savings. To involvements of really starting to braid these braided problems into braided funding mechanisms, and solution groups, where we're starting to bring together healthcare insurers, and folks. And we talked in our health session earlier this week about how we start to actually bring everyone from healthcare to housing, and cities or utilities together out of our silos, and really start to critically work together to support and resource retrofits that make houses more healthy and more efficient for our households throughout the region. To really working on this bigger level of energy optimization, electrification policies. How are they coupled with the legislation or the payments that are going through, and really looking at how we can get to a place where consumers really benefit from energy efficiency programs, and are aware of how to take advantage of those things. And so we've laid out quite a bit here. We've talked about them at length, but we also invite more. And we've had several of you add in the chat how you really see the opportunities to come up and against these policy gaps, or additional gaps or barriers that you're seeing. And that's really the point of why we're doing this work, and why we're bringing it to you today, is that, okay, we've got the information, now what? So what? How do we work together? How do we collaborate, convene, and really work into the action space of doing that, and really the point of this project. So I'll let Will take it home, and explain why it is that we're doing this, and really what the bigger picture looks like for this work.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. I think something that Maggie mentioned is really critical to repeat, and that is that energy insecurity is not just a single person's problem. It's not just a single industry's problem. It's a problem that has a lot of different entry points. It's a problem that requires, braiding funding and braiding expertise and resources together. And so at SIA, we're trying to figure out, how do we bring all of the relevant stakeholders who hold a piece of that puzzle to making these issues, better? How do we bring them all together in ways, that can be scaled across our region? And so I also want to kind of zoom out, because I think, it's important to sort of end by thinking about the big picture. And I think, it's important to note that energy insecurity is only a piece of the issue that we're confronting in our region. Energy insecurity really can show us that the benefits and burdens of generating, transmitting, and consuming energy have not been and are not evenly distributed across all groups of Southerners. But energy insecurity is only one piece of the bigger energy equity landscape. If we want true energy equity, we have to do more than simply address energy insecurity, although that's certainly a good start. We also have to address things like, how do we provide inclusion in the decision-making process for communities that previously have not had a voice in that process? And then finally, how do we reckon with the kind of long-term effects that the energy and housing sectors have had and likely will have as the climate changes moving forward? And so, the project that we're working on is really kind of an effort to deal with all of that and come to grips with kind of the big picture of what we're facing in our region. And so I just want to kind of frame that out really briefly, because I think it's an important point to wrap up on. So along with the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, SIA is working on a project to map out the landscape of energy equity. So beyond energy insecurity, what does energy equity look like in our region? And then how can we develop some frameworks to help decision makers in a variety of sectors? So not just in energy, but also housing, financing, et cetera. How do we create some frameworks that can help them kind of understand this landscape, understand what is their role in that landscape, and understand sort of what power do they have to make decisions that can lead us down a more equitable path. And so, you know, we really started this process trying to kind of grapple with, well, what actually is energy equity? What are the components of it? And that's a pretty broad question. And what we've come up with is this, that we think energy equity has to be achieved through three things. One is you have to include all the communities that are impacted by energy and housing decisions in the decision-making process. They have to have a voice. You know, they can't just be, you know, kind of have decisions made for them with no voice in those decisions. At the same time, we also have to ensure that the benefits and burdens of energy and housing are evenly distributed. That's the energy insecurity component, right? Access and energy insecurity are kind of go hand in hand. And then finally, we have to grapple with the unjust legacies of the past if we're going to create a more equitable future, and especially if we're going to be able to move past them as we're facing conditions in the South, rising temperatures, sea level rise, climate change, that potentially can make these issues even worse. So those three components are critical to any effort to bring equity to the energy sector. And like I said, no single entity, whether it's a utility, whether it's a public utility commission, whether it's state policymakers, or what have you, touches all of these points in exclusion. And so it's going to take a multidisciplinary braided effort if we're going to actually be able to make some headway. And so just to kind of wrap up, this is sort of what that's going to look like. You know, we have to make sure that housing access is evenly distributed, that people have access to quality housing regardless of race or income. We have to make sure that energy efficiency programs also distributed regardless of race and income, and that people know about them and know how to use them, and that the barriers to using those programs are reduced. On the inclusion front, we have to ensure that public engagement from utilities, cooperatives, and policymakers includes the communities that are most impacted by those decisions, whether that's rate making, whether that's integrated resource planning, or whether that's building energy codes. The communities that are most impacted have to be included in that decision-making process in a real way if those decisions are going to be equitable. And then finally, kind of in the long term, you know, we have to ensure that we are able to mitigate the effects of climate change, which, you know, if not, are going to disproportionately impact communities based on race and wealth. At the same time, we need to ensure that green infrastructure is provided regardless of demographic characteristics of neighborhoods. We also need to ensure that health impacts of all of these policies are equitably apportioned across different communities. And so really only when we begin to kind of put all of these things together can we truly start to see, you know, all of the dimensions that are needed to achieve energy equity, but also, you know, I think also all the different stakeholders who have a piece of this. And you know, I think that helps us begin to have the conversations that we need to have that cross out of the energy, that cross out of housing, that cross out of health, and begin to engage all of these groups in order to create effective solutions. So I'm going to wrap it up there. We're happy to take some questions now and, you know, talk a little bit more about this if that would be helpful. And we just love to hear from you. I mean, you know, how does this information, is this new to you? Does this strike you as useful in your own organization's efforts to improve equity or, you know, reckon with some of the energy insecurities that we see across the region? And just kind of other thoughts about this, because ultimately, you know, we want to ensure that this information is in the hands of people who are, you know, poised to make decisions about these issues and poised to really, you know, have the potential to include all communities and all stakeholders in these questions. So I'll wrap it up there. And you know, I think, Maggie, if they want to provide questions or comments, I'm wondering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think the best way to do that is if you have a question or a comment, you can feel free to add that to the chat. We'll read it out and hopefully be able to somewhat answer those pieces. Or if it's coming to your mind right now, feel free to raise your hand. There's enough folks here that I want to make sure we're not speaking over each other, but use the raise your hand function, and we'd love to have you chat and chime in. We know we just threw a lot at you. We talked at you for quite a bit. And I also will put a link to the presentation that we shared in the chat. So you have that now to pull up at your leisure. We'll make sure that you have access to that after this as well. But we want to make sure that we hear from you if you have anything you want to add. Oh, Alicia, it looks like you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I learned a lot. I've only been able to attend maybe half of the presentations through the conference, but this one was just really particularly illuminating for me. I'm aware that we've got a lot of these challenges in Mississippi with so many hurdles that customers have to try to deal with every single day. So just grateful for the data-driven presentation, and look forward to diving into it a little bit more with some of our team afterwards.
Thank you for that. And I'll do the advocating on Will and I's behalf, but we're happy to walk through some of this for you and your team should you want that. This is also being recorded, so we're of course happy to share the recording. But if there are specific pieces, like we have the specific pieces we talked about Memphis, the reason that exists is because we've worked with the city of Memphis around some of these pieces. Same thing for Georgia. We're happy to go into Mississippi or any other state that fits into a region because we have the data, but we're happy to splice it for ways that y'all can find it useful. We've got something from Betsy in the chat. Thank you, Betsy. We're hopeful that this work does prove timely for folks, and we're happy that it does for you and your work in East Kentucky. That inequity, unfortunately, we pretty much all see it daily when we're working and looking critically at the work that we do. And we're hopeful that this data will really start to illuminate some of the paths forward to really put a nail on the head of our event series here, but really illuminate how we walk across that path and who we all bring in as a part of that process.
And I may throw out a question just for everybody that I would be interested in hearing. So, I think a lot of what the work shows for us is that no one sector can solve this problem simply by waving a magic wand and having things be changed, right? Like the utilities have a piece of it, the public service commissions have a piece of it, state policymakers have a piece of it. All of these are key pieces, right? Housing stakeholders, public housing officials, they all have key pieces, but none of those pieces add up to the whole yet. So the question I think that I'm really interested in is how do we, as an industry, because I imagine a lot of the people in this room, I think, are probably from the energy side of things, although I could be wrong about that, but how do we, as an energy industry and sector, sort of begin to move beyond the limitations of that sector and invite in other stakeholders in productive ways? I think this is a question that everybody is talking about, right? Like, how do we get private insurers to help pay for home retrofits? How do we get Medicaid to help pay for healthy housing improvements? These are all questions that I think are important pieces of the conversation. But so far, I don't know that we've really done that effectively as an industry. And the result is that these efforts are very much siloed. And so, although we may tackle one small piece of the equity equation, those efforts aren't coordinated, and those efforts really don't have maybe the scalability that they could have. So I guess the question, is, have you seen potential solutions? I know we talked, we asked you earlier about specific solutions to like energy and security, but when we think about energy equity and starting to reach across the aisle to stakeholders who have a piece of it but haven't really been involved in the conversations with us, have you seen that happening effectively in your part of the region or nation? And if so, like what has worked and what hasn't? I'm very curious about that, because that's something that we're grappling with right now.
So I have a question for you, William. First of the presentation was amazing, and looking at the historic, this is Sepida, by the way, looking at the historic data and seeing how pretty much every segment of the economy played in creating this problem, right? From lending, from banking to energy, so on and so forth. Is there in the South, is there a recognition of ownership on these I guess, structures, that they actually are part of the problem that is created? Or is there any conversation around that? I'm curious about that.
That's a great question. I think this for us and how SIA interacts with folks is that this is really starting a lot of those conversations. We've had the opportunity since we started really looking in and around this data and this information in what was it? Well, July. So we've come a long way since since the summer. Is that we're being able to start to have these conversations and really allowing folks into the information that allows for the ownership of the problem, and being able to recognize, oh, okay, my organization or my industry or the way that this is played out, not only maybe it was part of what our industry played in the beginning, but I also have the ownership and responsibility and accountability and the ability to change the path going forward, right? I have the wherewithal within my organization or my industry or within the resourcing or the policy that we create as decision makers to really look at that overall impact. And really those conversations for us around this information in particular has started really due to this work that we've started here in 2020. And we're hopeful that those conversations will not only continue, but to expand, to start to include some of those other groups that we're not yet talking to, because we don't know just yet as we sit at SIA, from financing organizations to healthcare or insurers, and we're starting to build and bond those relationships. But we're learning, and we're hopeful that what we bring to the table will help folks learn about their little stake, or sometimes their super large stake, and the realities of right now. And I want to make sure that we answer your other question in the chat about an umbrella organization that brings together housing, health, the energy, et cetera. And to be completely honest, we don't have one. There are some organizations that act as connectors and networks for folks, but really the folks who are involved in that are all, again, looking for how organizations then within a state or within a locality can really start to work and network and bridge together so that there is an umbrella. But what we know is that right now, while they may exist on national scales for best practice sharing or conversations at a more national level, there isn't that regularly, routinely, or really at all as it pertains to the real decision making levels at the state and local levels in our region.
and I'll just put in a plug. So, one of the I guess points of this project that we are doing with TEPRI is to begin to craft some shared narratives, because part of the problem is that everybody understands the problem differently, right? Like if you are a Medicaid care management organization in Georgia, you see these problems in a very different light than, say, Georgia Power or the city of Atlanta, or any of the sort of half dozen other stakeholders who have some impact on that situation. And so, the problem is that all of these groups speak different languages. They have a different understanding of the problem, frankly. And, we need to start, I think, crafting some shared narratives and shared understandings of, how does this affect us as a region? Where did it come from? What are solutions to this that are not necessarily only energy or only housing or only health? And how you start to kind of make a case that this is a win-win-win for multiple stakeholder groups in our region and for people who live in our region, frankly. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line, that it's a win for them, and that should bring a lot of people to the table. You would hope, but so far it has not, right? So I think like part of the project is trying to say, okay, so who has authority or decision-making power over this small piece of it? And then how do we get kind of a broader context into their hands so that they can see, potential intersections with other actors, whether that's, a utility thing that they maybe have interest in common with Medicaid, or with, hospitals in rural areas, or, public housing authorities, and beginning to have conversations with this. So part of the project is really to kind of start to create a shared understanding of the problem and shared way of talking about it, so that we can actually maybe begin to break down some of these barriers, and provide people with kind of a big picture context of what is going on, how do we get to this point, and then specifically for you, what part of this do you hold?
Well, we want to say thank you, not only for attending our super long presentation where we threw a ton at you, and like Kelsey says in the chat, has probably your jaw on the floor. I promise you every day, for us, when we uncover more data or splice something in a different way, we have that same expression of like, are you kidding? Like, is this real? And it really does set the stage for the work that we do, that SIA does, the work that we hope to partner with all of you and others throughout our industry, and all of the other potential partnerships across and collaboration across other sectors, not only in the Southeast, but nationally. And we thank you for attending our event series. This week, the path forward would not be possible without all of you and the many others who were able to join us. So we thank you for ending out the path forward with us here talking about these very intense topics. Will has put our emails in the chat, but of course you can always find our information for us or anyone else that you've talked to or heard from this week at our website, calliance.org. And we look forward to learning more about you, your organizations, and partnering hopefully in 2021. So thank you all, and we look forward to future conversations.